If your tomatoes are flowering well but giving you fewer fruits than expected right now, or your cucumbers seem healthy but suddenly slow down in growth, there is a good chance the problem is not fertilizer, not watering, and not even the weather. Every year I see gardeners working hard through late June, doing everything they believe is right, and then wondering in August why the harvest is smaller than they hoped. The truth is that the last days of June and the first half of July often decide what kind of vegetable harvest you will carry home later in summer. Many people focus only on spring planting and forget that this period is when tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, beans, zucchini, and many other crops begin their most important stage. This is when plants build strength, form flowers, create new fruit, and prepare for the heavy production that comes later. And this is exactly where many gardeners make a costly mistake. They plant, transplant, prune, feed, or disturb plants on days when the garden would have been better left alone. I learned this many years ago from older gardeners who always kept a small calendar in their pocket. They were not blindly following the moon. They simply paid attention to timing. They watched the sky, the soil, the weather, and the condition of the plants. Over the years, I noticed something interesting. When important jobs were done during the right periods, plants often recovered faster from stress, rooted more easily, and seemed to keep growing without interruption. When the timing was poor, even healthy plants sometimes struggled for no obvious reason. In this video, I want to show you the most favorable days during late June and early July 2026 for tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, beans, beets, carrots, lettuce, dill, parsley, and other popular garden crops. I will also show you which days are better for feeding, watering, pruning, and repeat sowing. Just as importantly, I will explain which days are best avoided for serious planting and transplanting, and why weather conditions in Poland must always come before any calendar. Because there is one mistake many gardeners still make at the end of June that can quietly reduce the harvest for the rest of summer. And before we finish today, I want to make sure you do not make it. One thing I learned after decades of gardening is that late June is when many gardeners become too confident. The beds are full, the plants look strong, the weather is warm, and people start thinking the difficult part is already behind them. But in reality, this is often when the most important decisions are made. Tomatoes are forming clusters of flowers. Cucumbers are beginning their heavy growth phase. Peppers are trying to build both roots and fruit at the same time. Beans are establishing themselves for weeks of production ahead. If these crops experience unnecessary stress now, the effects can follow them through the rest of the season. This is why I always pay special attention to the period around the new moon. In 2026, the new moon falls near the end of June, and many traditional gardeners avoid major planting and transplanting work during the day before, the day of, and the day after this period. Instead of forcing plants through additional stress, I use those days for simpler tasks. I remove weeds. I inspect leaves for disease. I repair supports. I check ties on tomatoes. I prepare compost or mulch. These jobs may not feel exciting, but they save a lot of trouble later. The mistake most people make is seeing an empty space in the garden and immediately wanting to plant something regardless of conditions. I have done it myself. Sometimes the seed germinates poorly. Sometimes the transplant sits still for a week. Sometimes a healthy plant suddenly struggles without an obvious reason. Over time, I notice that patience often gives better results than rushing. Another thing many gardeners forget is that June weather in Poland can change very quickly. One week may feel like midsummer. The next week may bring cold rain, strong winds, and a sharp drop in temperature. That is why I never rely on the lunar calendar alone. If the soil is cold and soaked after several days of rain, I wait. If a heat wave is coming, I postpone transplanting. The moon can help with timing, but weather always has the final word. As we move into the more favorable growing days after the new moon period, opportunities begin to open for beans, lettuce, dill, parsley, and several other crops. But there is one group of vegetables that deserves special attention during the first days of July because what you do with them then can influence your harvest all the way into September, and this is where many gardeners unknowingly miss one of the best opportunities of the entire summer. Now we come to the period that many experienced gardeners quietly wait for every year. The first days after the new moon often coincide with renewed activity in the garden, and this is when I start paying close attention to crops that can still give excellent results before the season begins to slow down. If you have empty spaces in your beds, early July can be surprisingly productive. Many people think planting season is already over by then, but that is far from true. This is often an excellent time for repeat sowings of lettuce, dill, parsley, spinach in cooler areas, and especially various types of beans. I know gardeners who harvest fresh greens almost until autumn, simply because they continue sowing small amounts every few weeks instead of planting everything at once in spring. Few people do this consistently, yet it is one of the simplest ways to keep the garden productive for much longer. Around the favorable growing days at the beginning of July, I also like to sow another row of bush beans if space allows. The soil is warm, germination is usually fast, and the plants often establish themselves quickly. The same applies to certain varieties of beets and carrots intended for later harvests. Many gardeners are surprised by how well these crops can perform when planted during warm summer conditions. But while new sowings are important, the real stars of the garden right now are usually tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and zucchini. These plants are entering a stage where support matters more than many people realize. A mistake I see every year is gardeners focusing only on fertilizer while ignoring simple maintenance. A tomato branch overloaded with flowers may need tying. A cucumber plant may need guidance onto its support. Lower leaves touching wet soil may need removal. Small actions like these often prevent bigger problems later. An older gardener once told me something that stayed with me for years. He said that during late June and early July you should spend more time observing than working. At first I did not understand what he meant. Later I realized he was right. The plants themselves often tell you what they need. Leaves reveal moisture problems. Flower production reveals nutrient balance. Growth reveals root health. When you learn to notice these signals, the garden becomes much easier to manage. And in just a moment we arrive at one of the most important parts of this entire period, because the days that are best for feeding and watering can have a surprisingly large effect on tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers during the weeks ahead. If there is one thing that separates an average summer harvest from an excellent one, it is not usually planting. It is what happens after planting. During late June and the first half of July, tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and zucchini are working harder than at almost any other time of the season. They are producing new leaves, building stems, creating flowers, and trying to develop fruit all at the same time. That takes a tremendous amount of energy. This is why I always pay attention to the favorable days for feeding and deep watering during this period. Many traditional gardeners prefer to apply fertilizers during the waxing moon phase, when plants are believed to direct more energy into above-ground growth. Whether you fully believe that or not, one thing is certain. Healthy plants respond best when feeding is timed with active growth. I prefer simple methods. A good compost tea, diluted nettle feed, well-rotted compost around the base of plants, or balanced fertilizer often provides everything most gardens need. The mistake many people make is feeding too heavily because they want faster results. Instead of helping the plant, they create soft growth that becomes more vulnerable to disease and weather stress. I learned many years ago that moderate feeding applied at the right time often produces stronger plants than large amounts of fertilizer. Watering follows a similar principle. Most gardeners focus on frequency. I focus on depth. A shallow watering may make the surface look wet, but deep roots need moisture much further down. During hot periods at the end of June, I would rather water thoroughly and less often than lightly every day. This encourages stronger root systems and better drought resistance later in summer. Another old habit I still follow is avoiding heavy pruning during unfavorable lunar periods, especially close to the full moon. Instead, I reserve those days for observation and maintenance. Then, during more favorable periods, I remove unnecessary tomato suckers, improve air circulation, and tidy plants that have become overcrowded. Few people realize how much better airflow can reduce disease pressure during humid summer weather. At the same time, I keep a close eye on strawberries, cabbage, and potatoes. These crops are entering important stages of development as well. Small adjustments made now often prevent much larger problems in July. But there is another date in this calendar that many gardeners pay attention to every year. It arrives with the full moon, and whether you follow lunar gardening closely or simply use it as a planning guide, this period is usually treated very differently from the rest of the month for one important reason that every vegetable gardener should understand. Now let us talk about the full moon period, because this is where many gardeners slow down and become much more selective about what they do in the garden. Around the full moon in early July 2026, many traditional lunar calendars advise avoiding major planting and transplanting work. Over the years, I noticed that even gardeners who are not strict followers of lunar gardening often use these days differently. Instead of disturbing roots or moving plants, they focus on maintenance and observation. And honestly, I think there is a lot of wisdom in that approach. By this point in the season, the garden is already showing its strengths and weaknesses. Tomatoes reveal whether they are setting fruit properly. Cucumbers show whether pollination is going well. Peppers begin displaying their first serious crop potential. This makes the full moon period an excellent time to evaluate rather than interfere. One thing I always do during these days is walk through the garden slowly and inspect every crop. Most people rush. They water quickly, pull a few weeds, and leave. But many problems can be caught early simply by paying attention. A few yellow leaves on tomatoes may suggest a nutrient imbalance. Curled cucumber leaves may indicate stress from heat or inconsistent watering. Small holes in cabbage leaves may reveal pest activity before it becomes serious. These little signs often appear long before major damage occurs. Another task I like to schedule during this period is mulching. Few people realize how valuable mulch becomes in July. A layer of grass clippings, straw, or other organic material helps stabilize soil temperature, reduce evaporation, and protect plants during heat waves. An older gardener showed me this many years ago. He used to say that summer mulch is like free insurance for the garden. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. After several dry summers, I realized he was absolutely right. The difference between mulched and bare soil can become dramatic when temperatures rise. This is also a good time to remove spent lettuce, old spinach, and other spring crops that are no longer productive. Clearing those spaces prepares the garden for later sowings. And this brings us to something many gardeners overlook completely. The middle of July may seem late, but several vegetables can still provide surprisingly good harvests when planted correctly. In fact, one simple strategy used during this period can keep fresh greens coming long after many gardens have already slowed down, and that is exactly what we are going to look at next. One of the biggest surprises for many gardeners is discovering that the season is far from over by the middle of July. I hear people say every year that planting time has finished, and now all that remains is waiting for the harvest. But experienced gardeners often think differently. They know that a productive garden keeps working in stages. As one crop slows down, another takes its place. As one bed becomes empty, another opportunity appears. This is why I pay close attention to the favorable days that arrive after the full moon period. These are often excellent days for repeat sowings of fast-growing greens. Lettuce, dill, parsley, and certain leafy crops can still provide weeks of fresh harvests. Instead of planting one large row, I prefer sowing smaller amounts every couple of weeks. This simple habit keeps fresh leaves available much longer and avoids the problem of everything maturing at the same time. Very few gardeners use this method consistently, yet it costs nothing and often doubles the usefulness of a small garden. During this same period, I continue monitoring tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers carefully. By now, the plants are carrying increasing numbers of fruits. Many gardeners become excited and begin adding extra fertilizer, hoping for even larger harvests. This is where another common mistake appears. Excess feeding during fruit development often creates more leafy growth instead of better production. I prefer focusing on steady watering, healthy soil, and good airflow around the plants. Those simple actions usually deliver better results than constantly adding products. Another forgotten practice I learned many years ago is harvesting regularly. Many people leave beans, cucumbers, and zucchini on the plant too long. The plant then begins directing energy toward mature fruit instead of producing new ones. Frequent harvesting encourages continued production and often extends the harvest season considerably. This small habit may be one of the easiest ways to increase yields without spending any money. I also continue watching weather forecasts closely. By July, summer storms can arrive suddenly. Heavy rain, strong winds, and unexpected temperature changes sometimes affect plants far more than lunar phases ever could. This is why I always remind gardeners that the calendar is a guide, not a rule book. Healthy plants, good soil, and common sense must always come first. And when all these pieces come together correctly, something very rewarding begins to happen as the second half of summer approaches. The garden becomes stronger, more productive, and far easier to manage. But before we finish, there is one final lesson that ties everything together and explains why timing matters much more than most people realize. When I look back at all the seasons I have spent in the garden, one lesson stands out more than almost anything else. Good harvests rarely come from one big secret. They come from dozens of small decisions made at the right time. Late June and early July may seem like just another part of summer, but in many ways they help determine what your garden will look like in August and September. This is when tomatoes build their fruit clusters. Cucumbers begin their most productive period. Peppers gain strength for the harvest ahead. Beans, zucchini, beets, carrots, and leafy greens all respond to the care they receive now. The gardeners who pay attention during these weeks are often the same people carrying baskets full of vegetables later in the season. What I like most about using a lunar gardening calendar is not that it guarantees perfect results. Nothing can do that. Weather changes, soil conditions vary. Every garden is different. The real value is that the calendar encourages us to slow down and think about timing. Instead of rushing into every task the moment we think about it, we become more deliberate. We observe more carefully. We plan a little better. And, surprisingly often, the garden rewards that patience. If I could leave you with one simple piece of advice, it would be this. Use the favorable days for planting, feeding, and important garden work. Use the less favorable days for observation, maintenance, and preparation. But always let the condition of your plants and the weather guide the final decision. A warm, healthy soil will usually help a plant more than any date on a calendar. As we move deeper into summer, continue sowing small amounts of greens, harvest regularly, water deeply, support your crops, and keep watching what the plants are telling you. Most of the answers are already there if we take the time to look. And when August arrives and your tomatoes are heavy with fruit, your cucumbers keep producing, your peppers are filling out, and fresh greens are still coming from the garden, you will be glad you paid attention to these important weeks. Gardening has a way of rewarding consistency more than perfection. And there is one more summer habit that many older gardeners quietly use to extend harvests even further into autumn. We will talk about that in the next video because it might be one of the simplest ways to keep your garden productive long after most people think the season is already ending.